Ladies and gentlemen, welcome to the Revenue Task Force for the City of Salem. And I believe we start with roll call, so, okay. So I guess you would just answer present or here, just like grade school, right? Okay. So Becky Beeman. Here. Russ Beaton. Here. Scott Canwine. Here. Katie Ciosetta. It's a great Italian name. Ken Collins. Present. Beth Duncan. Beth Vargas Duncan is here. Beth Vargas Duncan. Yes, very good. Bev Eklund. Here. Matthew Hale. Here. Levi Herrera Lopez. Here. Stephen Jenkins. Here. Kathy Knock. Here. Ariel Leval. Here. Melissa Masiba. Malia. Lee McKenzie. Here. Raquel Moore Green. Here. Sean Nickus, that's me, hey, here. Keith Norris. Here. Jean Palometer. Jean. Ray Quisenberry. Here. Nate Raffin. Here. Jesus Resendez. Jesus? No. David Reinhold. Here. Bill Ricci. Vacancy to your right. Okay. Gretchen Schilly. Here. Caitlin Strafty. Caitlin? No. Bill Smalden. TJ Sullivan. Here. Kathy Vanek Fort. Here. That's it. That's all I got. That's the whole list.
Thank you so much, Chair.
And next up, we would be doing public testimony. Do we have public testimony? I have one person signed up here. Please state your name and ward.
Thank you, Mr. Chair, members of the committee. My name is Jim Shepke, and I live in Ward 2. And I have a handout for you tonight. And what this is a benchmarking analysis of the Salem Public Library. And what it does is compare our library to 7 peer libraries around the state, and also every library serving more than 30,000 people in the state. And it's lengthy, it has lots of good data for you, and I'm just going to read a few sentences from the conclusion that hopefully will motivate you to read the whole thing. So here goes. Based on this benchmarking analysis of state library data from fiscal year 2023, it's not an exaggeration, I believe, to conclude that the Salem Public Library is the worst major public library in the state of Oregon. It has the worst funding per capita and nearly the worst staffing and volunteer hours per capita. With the recent reduction of main library operating hours to only 38 per week, it has the worst main library operating hours among major libraries in Oregon. Poor funding, staffing, and collection expenditures lead to poor performance. Perhaps most concerning is the fact that all preschool children are not being adequately served with frequent accessible reading programs, which I believe contributes greatly to the poor outcome we see later on when reading proficiency is tested in our schools. And just as an aside, only 24% of our third graders in Salem-Keizer schools can pass the state reading test, 24%. And in Beaverton, which does about 8 times as many reading programs as our library, that percentage is 56%. So that's what's happening. I need to emphasize that none of this is the fault of the library staff. Their efforts have been nothing short of heroic in attempting to continue to offer quality public library services in the face of relentless and severe budget and staffing cutbacks over many years. The fault lies with us in failing to support our library, as other Oregon cities and counties have done. So you have this report. I hope you'll read it. I also gave you an interesting report about how, believe it or not, 20 years ago in 2003, our library had exactly double the hours it has today. It had 96 hours per week at both facilities. Today it has 48, and that's terrible. That's like the worst it's been. And what I didn't put on this report, but I wanted to add it, is in 2003, we also had
Thank you, Mr.
29
Shepke.
bookmobile stops. And Bev Eklund knows all about that. Thank you very much.
I believe that was our only public comment for tonight.
Then I guess that closes our public comments.
Okay. I'm going to share our presentation. There we go. All right, everyone. Welcome to your second task force meeting. Thank you again for being on time. A couple of things that I wanted to just cover before we get into it. So we're in a new space today. The purpose of moving to council chambers was for better visibility, better transparency into what we're talking about, because this is all wired to be able to be broadcast much more effectively than the Anderson room. We're happy to take your feedback after this meeting as to how this went. We know you're in tight, and thank you for your flexibility as we continue to work on balancing the needs of who's in the room with making sure that we are as transparent as possible as we manage this process. So tonight, we're going to go through a little bit of a recap of the last meeting, talk about revenue targets, and then start to get an introduction into revenue options. We have a really big packet to share with you soon. If you haven't done enough reading, we have more reading for you. And then we'll talk a little bit about what happens next. Any questions or comments about our agenda tonight before we get into it? Yes, Becky. Can you please use your microphone?
Thank you. I am accustomed to seeing the meeting minutes before the meeting so that I can read them. Is that not going to happen here?
The minutes from the prior
Yeah,
January 30th?
normally when I'm on things, I see the minutes before the meeting so that if there's any issues, I've had a chance to review the minutes.
Were they sent out?
They were sent out. The meeting minutes from the previous meeting were emailed out to this group, and I believe they're also posted online. But we don't have a printout of them this evening. We just have this evening's agenda.
And they weren't
printout.
part of the homework that we got for the meeting. They weren't attached to that.
I believe that they were attached to a follow-up email.
Okay, thank you.
Anyone else? All right, and that was a good reminder. We're sharing microphones. Green means on, and only 3 microphones can be on at one time. Okay, back to you.
I'll take a motion to approve the minutes. Is it?
So moved. Second.
Is there any objection to the minutes? Am I allowed to then say by acclamation the minutes are accepted?
No, we do need to take a vote.
Oh, we do need to take a vote. Okay.
Can we do a
So
voice
I
vote?
move it to a vote? I mean,
Yeah,
okay.
so you can say all in favor?
Oh, all in favor. I got it. All in favor?
Aye.
Any opposed?
Anyone abstaining?
The motion passed. Anyone abstaining? The motion passes.
Thank you. All right. So let's get into it. So, hi again, everyone. I'm Colleen Rosillas from Moss Adams. I am joined by a couple of other colleagues tonight while you get to know our whole team throughout this process. Annie Rose, you want to introduce yourself?
Hello, really nice to see you all in person. I'm Annie Rose Favre. I'm a senior manager with the Moss Adams team. You have received quite a few emails from me, so I really appreciate all of the conversation that we've already been able to have. I've been working with the city of Salem since about 2019, so I'm very much looking forward to working with you all in this process. Thank you.
Hey everyone, I'm Tommy Conkling. I'm a senior with Moss Adams, public finance nerd, spreadsheet aficionado. Really happy to be with you all today.
That's why we keep Tommy around. All right, and we once again have plenty of lovely city staff in the room to answer questions as needed, and they are sprinkled about. We won't go through individual introductions again, but we may turn to them to answer questions if needed. A reminder of our timeline. So we're at meeting number 2, and we're just going to try to wrap up our education piece and start to look at revenue options today. Our next 2 meetings will have some really great inputs. So we're starting focus groups next week. We're doing 1 focus group per ward, and we'll be able to provide quite a bit of information from focus groups about community priorities, questions and concerns when we come back in a month. We also will be doing a community survey, and that will happen at the end of March to be able to inform that April meeting. And we assume we're gonna have some town halls once we start to get some more information kind of mid-April. And that will wrap us up into June where we have our decision-making meetings. So we're still in the early stages. And as a reminder, there are no stupid questions. And I'm gonna hand this over to Annie Rose.
Great note to move us into our next section here. So we know not all of you were able to be at the last meeting, so we wanted to do a quick recap of some of the primary points that we covered during our last meeting here. And for that, we wanted to reiterate the purpose of the task force. I'm sure you are all well aware of why you are here, but really some of the key factors here are obviously group is going to be reviewing what is the city's current financial situation, what is the scale of the potential revenue shortfall here. You're also going to be considering all of the revenue options. We're going to be starting that process this evening, but really trying to understand what are all of the potential options that are on the table here so that you can narrow these down and bring forward a recommendation to City Council for potentially for adoption in the future. So that is the purpose of what all of this work is here to do. And one piece that I wanted to highlight in terms of roles and responsibilities, because we sometimes get questions about this, is that the role of all of us here as part of how this group was put together, as part of how the charter for this group was formed, this is based on the idea that we are all going to be participating constructively to identify potential revenue sources. And so sometimes when we do groups like this, we get this question of, I have great ideas for budget cuts. I have a question of whether we even need revenue sources as a city. All of those fantastic questions, but not questions that we're going to be addressing as part of the scope of this group. So if those questions come up, we are very happy. We have a parking lot put up over here for anything that's out of scope for conversation. We can also direct you to the various city staff who can answer those questions and have those conversations as well. But we just wanted to reiterate that, again, the scope of this particular group as designated by City Council is to really think, what are those revenue options and how can we bring them forward and make a strong recommendation to council there. The only other piece I wanted to go through was the group norms. This was a list that you all compiled last time. So we are going to bring this back at every meeting because this is one of the kind of key foundational pieces that we're going to want to turn to in terms of how do we have these conversations with each other? How do we treat each other when we are in a group together? So I'm not going to read through every single one of these, but I wanted to give you a moment to come back and take a look at these. Remember what was committed to in the last meeting as well. And if need be, we can come back to these as a group if there's ever a point moving forward when that would be relevant too. The last piece that isn't on this list that is more of a logistical piece, I did want to highlight, Colleen had mentioned before, we are going to be using microphones to help with some of the broadcast. When you do use your microphone, please do say your name. Introduce yourself before speaking. That will help everybody just keep track of who's who in the room. So thank you for that in advance. And that being said, we've done a lot of talking so far tonight, so we are going to ask you to turn to a neighbor, so either find one person next to you. I think some of you are probably going to be grouping up in pairs of 3, essentially, but we would love you to turn to a neighbor, introduce yourself if you don't already know the person sitting next to you, and share for 1 or 2 minutes just one new thing that you learned at the last meeting. So we'll give you a couple minutes to do that. All right, I'm going to bring us back together.
You might need that gavel.
I think I do need that gavel. Sean, can we get a gavel hit there? Yeah, thank you. All right, I'm going to bring us back together. Thank you for doing that. We will continue to do this throughout the process as well, because part of this is also you all working together. So thank you for taking that time. So now I'm going to hand it over to Colleen to kick us off on the revenue targets conversation and discussion here.
All right, so you all received a pretty lengthy pre-read packet that had information about the revenue gaps, potential revenue targets. We're going to go through some of that information today and have a robust discussion about it. So we're going to review those options. Before we dig in, we just want to talk a little bit about the history of general fund revenue, what all goes into that, and other work that has been done over the past couple of decades around revenue generation at the city. And Tommy's going to lead you through that.
Hello again, Tommy Conkling, Moss Adams. I'm going to walk us through a short history of major events in Salem's general fund over the past 3 decades, but predominantly the past 2, giving some context about how we got where we are today. So the first major events, and arguably the most important, are the passage of Measures 5 and 50 statewide in 1990 and 1997. As was shown in the first pre-read packet that you all received, not this one, but the one right beforehand, these statewide measures place limits on property taxes, which are really the bread and butter of local government throughout the state. These limits had relatively small effects at first, but the limits compounded over time, and they have large effects today. Next up, we all know in 2007 and 2008, the global financial crisis occurs and the Great Recession kicks off. And this negatively affects all local government funding across the country, including in Salem. In 2008, some of Salem's response is to freeze hiring for all positions except for public safety, and to close both municipal pools. The effects of the recession, as we all know, dragged on, and so 2 years later, Salem eliminated the then Community Services Department and 73 full-time equivalent employees. And the long tail of the recession continued, and so in 2013, 2 fire stations were eliminated and 42 full-time equivalent employees are let go. I think it's important to note in this corner of Salem's general fund history, although I wasn't a Salem resident at the time, and so forgive me for not having nuance that I think a lot of you probably have. But from fall 2007 to more than halfway through the 2010s or 20-teens, public sentiment for additional city revenues was probably next to non-existent. People were really feeling the economic squeeze of the worst recession since the Great Depression. Unemployment today in Oregon is about 3.5%. In 2009, it peaks in Oregon at about 11.5%. So proportionately, more than 3 times as many people are out of work. And that even understates how bad labor markets were, because a lot of people don't want to be part-time but are working part-time. And still, even 5 years later, in 2013, unemployment in Oregon is still more than double what it is today. In Salem specifically, in 2013, average home values are 25% lower than in their 2007 peaks. And so homeowners in the city are really feeling a tangible sense of lost wealth. Many people, the majority of their wealth is tied up in their homes, and that was disappearing. And so because of the effects of sort of economic conditions on public sentiment, or at least in tandem, in general, the city government just cuts during this time, like many other cities. They were far from alone. And this reduces government service levels for a population that continues to grow over these years. So in the mid to late 20-teens, economic conditions across the country, across the state, and in Salem started to show real signs of improvement. In November 2015, in Oregon, unemployment levels returned to their pre-recession levels. In fall 2016, Salem home prices are back to their pre-recession peaks. And so working to improve levels of city service, or at least get them closer to where they were prior to the Great Recession, Salem reopens Fire Station 8 in 2017 and Fire Station 11 in 2019. And in 2018, Salem homelessness services begin with the rental assistance program. However, it's also important to note that general fund revenues in Salem and across all Oregon local governments are still really hamstrung by measures 5 and 50 that were passed in the 90s. And these negative effects, like I said before, compounded over these years. Recognizing that expenditures are outpacing revenues in 2018, Salem formed the previous revenue task force looking at different revenue options for the city. And then in 2019, the task force recommends two things. One is the city operations fee, and then the other is the employee paid payroll tax. And then in 2020, the operations fee is implemented. However, we also know that 2020 is the de facto beginning of the COVID-19 pandemic in America. And so responding to this, the employee paid payroll tax is removed from the 2020 ballot. In 2020 and 2021, there's massive uncertainty across the whole country about how and if the economy would respond and come back from the pandemic. And there was also particular worry about the effects on local government funding and about the abilities of local governments to continue providing services to the communities that they serve. And so federal policymakers were really determined not to repeat the same pretty brutal mistakes that they made with the Great Recession by having stimulus that was undersized, which really prolonged the length of that recession. And so from 2020 to 2022, like the vast majority of local governments, Salem received federal funds through the CARES Act and the American Rescue Plan Act, which is also known as ARPA. And over these 3 years, it totaled about $27 million, and this helped to continue services during an incredibly uncertain time. This one-time infusion of funding meant that the city's need for additional revenues was delayed in urgency, but not affected in need, right? Even though it was less urgent, there was still a structural imbalance between revenues and expenditures, and that's why we're here today. And then in 2023, there were two significant events. Salem added commercial air service at the airport with support from the general fund, and the city operations fee was increased. This slide, which I wish was bigger for you all in person, hopes to show some of the events from my general fund timeline in the context of city service levels throughout these years. So the ratio of city employees to the population of city is a useful measure for estimating levels of service that people in the public receive. Government services are predominantly provided like people, like any organization that's providing predominantly services rather than goods. So the employee to population ratio is a good measure of the quality and quantity of service that the public is receiving. So also important context for this graph, in the late 1990s when Measure 50s passed, this Salem's population is about 125,000. Today it's, I think, over 180, somewhere 170 to 180. So you would see if the text was larger that in the late 90s, the ratio of employees to 1,000 residents of Salem is about 5.2, and it hovers around here until 2008. And then the Great Recession happens. There's a huge, large and rapid drawdown in employees, like many other local governments, and things stay at about this level for the next several years. Sort of in 2017, which is right under that last text box, or the second to last text box, you see a slight increase, but not by much, and we're still today well below the service levels that the city had before the recession. And so finally, again, with a graph that I wish that was slightly bigger, I want to provide today's task force in a little bit of context. So this graph shows general fund revenues, which are in blue, and it shows general fund expenditures, which are in gray. And it shows that from, 2010 to, and then projected through 2029. So broadly speaking, there's 3 periods of time in the past 5 or 6 years that you should understand in terms of the general fund. In that first green circle on the far left, you'll see expenditures start to outpace revenues. That gray line is a little bit above the blue. That's where the previous task force was working, and that's where the operations fee came from. That middle circle, where revenues outpace expenditures, it shows 2 things. To a limited extent, it shows the city operations fee starting to close a little bit of the gap between revenues and expenditures, but predominantly it shows that federal infusion of funds, like Salem received, like many other local governments. And then finally, that third ring is where you are today. That's why we're here. Expenditures are outpacing revenues, and they're going to get a lot bigger over time. Just trying to give some context about where we are. And with that, I'll turn it back to Colleen.
All right, so we're talking, oh, yes, Becky.
Becky Beeman, I have a question about kind of where the FTEs are, kind of as today. Is that including the reductions that were implemented most recently? Library staff is what comes to mind there.
Do you mean the ones at the most recent budget committee?
Yeah.
Yes, that's correct.
So if we were to continue where the line in our reading is, it would keep us with the reduction in staff that has already been implemented.
Correct. I believe so.
Thank you.
Yeah, Ken.
Yeah, just a question about
Could you state your full name? I'm sorry.
Ken Collins, Ward 8. The use of FTE to residents as a benchmark. How good is that and how accurate? I mean, I get fire and police, have got to grow with population, but you've got administration, you've got central services. So how does that work in the big picture? Is that the best, and is that a standard measure that other municipalities use?
Yeah, so that's a great question. Oh, I need to learn the rules of speaking and turn on my microphone. So that's a great question. So you're right that as sort of any organization grows, particularly with internal services, like you mentioned, that administrative overhead, there are going to be economies of scale. And so you're right that it is imperfect. It is a fairly common measure that's used, but to your point, it's not. Any sort of statistic tries to get at some fundamental truth that we can't know, but we can kind of feel around through the numbers, right? I promise this is going somewhere. And so even though it might not incorporate that administrative overhead efficiencies that you get, it also doesn't incorporate things that grow much faster, like demand for services that grows even much faster than population, right? So fire and police, the growth in demand for their services has far outpaced the growth in population. So to answer your question, it's a useful measure. It's not a perfect measure, and there are various factors that make it imperfect, but it's a fairly good measure of the quality and quantity of services provided by a government.
Nate Raffin. And this roughly 4 to 5 employees per capita, is that typical for cities of this size?
I'm not actually sure. I can't answer that off the top of my head.
Raquel Moore Green, Ward 3. My question goes back to piggybacks Ken's. So do you have the statistic for Marion County, what their ratio is? I'd be real curious as to what Marion County's ratio is.
So that's a good question. One thing I will call, it is useful. It is not entirely irrelevant to consider benchmarking for peers. But there is also, I think, particularly when you're thinking of counties versus cities, there's a big difference in sort of what is demanded. So I wouldn't be shocked if it was quite different. If any sort of comparison would be done, it would be through cities. And even then, there's a lot of idiosyncratic factors with cities. So it's not a bad idea, but comparing it to other cities, it's not going to tell you, oh, we need exactly X or Y more, fewer employees. It is a measure of service. Any other questions? Yes.
Just
Joe.
an observation. I seem to remember that often we are, Bill Smaldone, Ward 2. I seem to remember that we're often compared to Eugene, which is roughly the same size in terms of population, although those differences that you noted are probably also present. So it would be nice to see some kind of comparative numbers.
Yeah, I think that's definitely something we can look into. I think, so sort of a great example of sort of idiosyncratic things. We all know Eugene has University of Oregon. There's a lot of, I mean, I'm just making this up on the fly, but Salem doesn't have to deal with the degree of rowdy college students the University of Oregon has. So that's one example of how services are idiosyncratic depending on the city. So to your point, that is something that could certainly be done, but there's a lot of individual factors that it's not apples to apples completely. It's useful, but it's not perfect. Matthew, you had a question?
Tommy, Matt Hale, did your analysis take into account like productivity gains throughout the last several decades and output gains over the last several decades that the Bureau of Labor publishes?
Yeah, so that's a great point, particularly as in the past 12 months, productivity has increased a ton. The short answer is no. The longer answer is also, you're right that given the change in what has been 28 years since 1997 at the beginning of that graph, like your average worker is going to be much more productive. There is also more demand for services, like there's services that the city provides that they didn't. So that's another way that this is imperfect, right? Salem didn't provide community policing in 1997. They didn't provide homelessness services, right? And so services change over time. So even with the same amount of employees, as you're trying to, like I'm saying, with any statistic, try to approximate like level of service. You're right, this does not capture productivity gains, but it also doesn't capture what the additional burdens on staff that weren't there in the previous years. Yes, Becky.
Becky Beeman, when you say community policing, what activities are you talking about?
We're going to actually, pass that over to Keith for their answer there.
I think Keith is going to take the podium.
Hey, thank you. Keith Staley, City Manager for the City of Salem. Excuse me. So community policing can mean many things to many organizations. In the City of Salem, frankly, we don't do much community policing because the majority of our police force is directed at responding to emergency situations, essentially answering 911 calls and calls for service. If you have specific questions about how the City of Salem is currently providing community policing, we'll bring the police chief in and he can answer those questions directly and specifically.
Becky again. I think, and correct me if I'm wrong, everybody who's done the homework, I think it talks about community policing as something that's at risk here, which sounds like it's currently in the budget.
It is absolutely at risk, and it continues to erode every police officer that we reduce. It reduces our ability to engage our community in proactive policing. Essentially, community policing is proactive policing. It's problem solving with the community. And as you move from a call and response model, you lose the capacity to go out and engage the community because, frankly, your officers simply don't have time for that sort of engagement. They are literally rolling from one call to the next.
Thank you.
Sure.
If I might just say something about the subject. For a long time, we had a program in the city that rotated from neighborhood to neighborhood. It was part of the community response effort. or community policing effort. And I was in Ward 2 at the time when the neighborhood response effort, including community policing, landed in Ward 2, and we got a kind of beefed up police services. They came to all our neighborhood association meetings. There was a lot more police presence on the street. It had a salutary impact on the neighborhood, and then that program was then moved to other wards in the city. It was an effort to share a limited resource. And I think that limited resource is now gone. Yeah.
Hey, Keith, I have a question.
Yes, sir.
I don't know what the term is that you use, but you said that the officers are going.
Could you state your name, Bill?
Got that too.
I know.
Officers aren't able to go do, or they're going from call to call, is what you said. How many years ago back did that start?
I'm not sure. I'm not the police chief.
So it's not, I understand that, but it's not new.
It's not new, but it certainly is something that every year, as the population grows, since 2015, the city of Salem has added 26,000 residents. We do not have any more police officers today than we had in 2015.
Okay, so again, that's not new, but our budget crisis is new within the last year or two?
Our budget crisis goes back to 2005, 2003, 1990.
Okay.
Sure.
So I think a better example than community policing might be homelessness response. So that's something that cities across America did not provide 5 years ago, 15 years ago. Historically, that's actually been the job of county governments because the county has health department, human services, with rare exceptions, places like San Francisco, Denver, Seattle, places that have sort of more entrenched, unhoused challenges, but San Francisco is also a consolidated city-county. No one was really providing direct homeless services until the ARPA and CARES dollars of the pandemic that was directed by many cities to closing that gap because the crisis became so much more acute during that time. In 1997, we haven't looked at the budget, but my guess is there was very limited, if any, direct spending on homelessness. There may have been indirect based on, fire and EMS calls, but the landscape's very different, and that continues to take up a significant portion of the general fund. Yes.
Sean Nickus, Ward 7. I believe in the pre-reading we had for this meeting, there was the information that the police calls have actually over the last 10 years gone up fairly dramatically. And I know the library services, the story time usage has almost doubled over the last decade. So, I think you can see just through those two things that given that the number of police officers is actually down and the number of librarians is actually down, that means there's been a massive efficiency increase from that kind of point of view. That's the only way to really explain that when you look at those types of numbers. And anyway, it shows to kind of a good job that they've been doing.
Yeah, thank you for that input. I also want to go back just to the FTE per 1,000 and the service or the FTE standards for departments and that question about benchmarking. During last year's budget process, staff provided quite a bit of information around comparison of service levels, particularly around internal services, where it might be a little bit different city to city. We can absolutely link you to those materials so you can take a look. I will say, having spent more than 20 years in public sector consulting, benchmarking can only tell you so much. What we want to do is try to compare you to what does a community expect of us, what do we need to meet those levels, and what is the gap. That's the place to actually figure out where do we want to be staffed. One way to do that is to look at those pre-recession staffing levels, because that was a different level of service than the community is currently getting. That's kind of one way. But another way is to do, a cost per task analysis and really get in there with the strategic planning process and figure out what does the community want of us. You don't have the time for that right now, but it might be interesting to do at some point in the future. Levy?
Yeah, just Levy
Could you
Herrera
state your
Lopez.
name? I'm sorry.
Sorry, Levy Herrera Lopez. For my own clarification, the shelter services, are we talking about services being funded by the city, provided by someone else, or are they all being provided by city staff?
The answer is both. And I saw a hand over here. Yeah.
Beth Vargas Duncan, Ward 3. I just did a really quick search just out of curiosity. Eugene, back in 2021, had 175,000 population, and 1,500 employees is what they have today. And Salem, our population's rounding up slightly to 178,000 with, it says about 1,400 employees. Somebody in this room probably knows how many employees the city of Salem has, but just point of reference.
Thank you. Matt, or sorry, Bill, your hand was up? Oh, okay. I'm going to move us forward and talk just a little bit about these revenue targets. So before we get into our options, we want to make sure that everyone here understands what the target or potential target would be. This is not, you don't have to decide our target is X dollars, and we're not going to have to decide that today. Ultimately, we're making recommendations to council, and council's going to figure out how much revenue they're going to attempt to raise. But it's important for us to really understand the scale of the challenge and what potential pathways we could have, so that then we know, as we're assessing revenue options, what that could look like. So we have a couple of different ways of defining potential revenue targets that sort of short, medium, and tall. So the employee retention target is to just keep our same staffing levels today. So we're thinking about the 1,400 FTE that the city has, not laying anybody off. Service levels will continue to decline there because we're not keeping up with population demand, which is essentially the second target, which we're calling a service level target. It's maintaining the current standard of service in all of our public facing and internal services. If we match that simply with population growth, that's an additional revenue gap that the city has. And then finally, we have the sheltering target, and that is continuing to provide those sheltering services, which were funded primarily with one-time funds, and that increases the target even more. And we have some examples of that. Tommy's going to talk through the logic behind the numbers.
Hi again, Tommy Conkling, Moss Adams. So these are current cost estimates of those three revenue targets that my colleague Colleen was talking about. So importantly for all three, you'll see that costs generally increase over time for all three targets. For fiscal year, the first period is fiscal year 2025 through 2026. So that means July 1st, 2025 through June 30th, 2026. Through fiscal year 2029 to 2030. So a 5-year period, 5-year forecast. That's generally with best practices, the length of a forecast to have. So the employee retention target, and again, this means we're not adding new services, and actually we're going to see services decline over time with the growth in or service quality, quantity, et cetera, decline over time with population growth. It starts out with $9.7 million in that first fiscal year, and at the end of that 5-year period is $16.5 million. And again, this is just keeping current staff on, and over time you see service quality and quantity decrease due to the increase in population. So next, the service level target, and it says an additional for all these because that's on top of that base employee retention target. So it starts with an additional $6.1 million on top in that first fiscal year. Or was that $15.8 million total to retain current employees and to keep service levels steady in that year, adding in enough staff, materials, et cetera, to try to keep the service levels that we have now in the future. And then finally, for Salem sheltering services, so again, provided by the city and by others, maintaining sheltering services is estimated to be about $9.6 million in that first year, and then the growth is slightly less than the growth in other ones. By year 5, it's estimated to be at $11.7 million. And then my colleague will now, Colleen is going to explain in further depth how these different targets sort of interact.
Yeah, Becky.
When I look at the just the current FTE numbers, the rate of growth is quite uneven. In particular, from 2026 to 2027, it's a 1.3. So it's 100, it's a significant, whereas the growth from 2025-6 to the next year is 1.07. Are you including replacement of real stuff, or is this just FTEs and some kind of bizarre increase in cost?
Here comes the Chief Financial Officer to answer your question.
I'll attempt to answer your question. Josh Eggleston, Chief Financial Officer. So it's based on our general fund forecast, so it includes people, personnel services, as well as materials and services. There are certain things that are cyclical. So one thing that you'll identify with there is PERS rates are based on the state bienniums. So you'll have 2-year chunks of impact there where you'll see the same PERS rates for 2 years, then they'll go up for another 2 years. And we see similar cycles for other things as well. But in general, that's a lot of the variation that you'll see there.
All right. Oh, I'm sorry.
Stephen Jenkins. Actually, follow-up question to that, because I figured out the percentage increases, and so just trying to figure out, from 26, 27 to 27, 28, it's like a 27% increase on the employee, just at the employee retention target, which that's a big increase. So.
Yeah. So just to be clear, these are the incremental increases for each year. So so the general fund budget forecast $180 million. So these are the increases for each of the years. So like for fiscal year 2026, we're anticipating a $9.7 million deficit. The next year, it's 10.4. So the increase is just the difference between those two. In 27, the difference is again between those two. So just about $4 million difference between the fiscal year 27 and fiscal year 28. So percentage-wise, it is a large jump, but as a percent of the general fund, it's not as large as it appears here.
Becky Beeman, so from what I understood of your explanation to me was it may include things besides FTEs because it's other things, it's the shortfall and it's required to support the plan we've got, but it's more than just FTEs.
It is certainly more than FTEs. I will say the majority of the general fund costs are FTEs. It is personnel costs. And if I may, we'll certainly provide a link to the general fund 5-year forecast so you can see all the assumptions and percentages broken down by year. We publish that every year for the budget committee, and we presented it on January 10th, and that's available for you to view also.
All right, so let's talk about these potential pathways. So the first pathway is the city doesn't get any revenue. That is antithetical to the purpose of this task force, so we're not following pathway 1. That is the road less traveled. Pathway 2 would be just the employee retention target. We're looking at the cost here now for the general fund, what that potential deficit is for fiscal year 29-30. That's essentially taking us out 5 years and saying, here's the 5-year impact of the choices that we're making, because our goal is sustainable revenue too. If we close a budget gap for 2 years, then another task force is going to be right back here, and you might be asked to serve again. So think about that. The other option is, so pathway 3, we have that's $28.4 million gap, and so that's taking that current level of staffing plus continuing sheltering services. It's essentially that here's what we're doing today. We're not going to increase any levels of service or keep up with population. Pathway 4 is to provide the current level of staffing and then meet that population growth level, but not continue sheltering. And then the last, which is a $51.5 million annual general fund deficit, would be to achieve all 3 of those. And we are going to stop talking for a minute and, oh yes, go ahead, Ray.
Ray Quisenberry, Ward 1. These numbers, I was looking at.
Can you, I'm sorry, Ray, can you speak into your mic?
Sorry, I should just talk to the mic, right? The numbers seem pretty daunting, but reading the material that we got was talking about maybe a much better day back in 2007, when we were able to provide quite a few more services. And again, like I said, these numbers are very daunting, but what about a number that brings us back to that level of service?
Tommy, can you?
I need some assistance from Josh here. Would you mind repeating your question?
Yes, I'm looking at what we need to do
Yep.
to maintain existing services and provide for the homelessness that we're working on right now.
Yep.
I was wondering though about, we talked about a much rosier day for the city back in 2007. What do we need to do to get back to that?
So I believe there is something related included in, it's in the pre-read, it's under deferred needs analysis. The answer is a lot more than what we're considering here.
I assume that, yes.
This is really, the targets presented are not, these will not get you back to the level of city services that your median Salem resident got in 2008. The employee retention target is really just what do we need to keep the people who are here working here, and materials, et cetera. And then the service level target is how do we keep up service levels as they are now. In the, I think Josh wants to add something about deferred needs, maybe?
There we go. Yeah, so we can send some materials also. There is a little bit in your pre-read packet on page 4 about the city's deferred needs analysis, and it's not a good name. I've been told that a lot. But deferred needs. So we've done various studies throughout the years. Most recently, police needs assessment, fire standards of cover, the internal benchmarking analysis that Moss Adams referenced. So looking at all those various needs to get to a service level that's been demanded. So you'll hear numbers like between 30 and 80 police officers, 10 additional fire stations, some pretty big numbers in parks, code, library, everywhere. So it's about 308 positions, 307.5, that we would need to get to that level of desired service. We didn't include it as a target. We think it's a great ideal wish position. We don't think it's realistic to have a revenue source right now that would get us there.
Bill?
Bill Smaldone, Ward 2. I'm wondering though about that decision in light of what we're being asked to do. So, for example, I keep thinking about what is the vision of the city? The city councils over the years have developed that vision. They get elected to do that. They establish master plans, and then they try to reach the goals of the master plans using the resources available, and they never make it, right? One might argue that they're aspirational. And in a way, I kind of feel like we ought to be aspirational. We ought to know what the city would look like according to the vision of the councils that we've elected. What does the master plan say? How much would it cost to fully fund the city at the level that the people elected would like to? And then we can think about whether we, in this group, can shoot for a set of changes that would get us to that vision or to some level below it. But we would then have an idea, really, of the difference between what's aspirational, what would we want in the most perfect world, or at least in the world that's been selected by the current council, and the level that we're being asked to fund here. There seems to be a really big gap there, so it doesn't really resolve some of the city's problems.
We can work, I'm looking at Josh, we can work on providing that number to you. It's not going to be perfect, but we can work on that. I saw a lot of nodding around. Yeah, Scott.
Scott Cantonwine, Ward 5. Adjusting my microphone 1 second. So in a number of the pre-read materials and also some of the materials shared here today, it seems like one new cost center that grows fairly rapidly is sheltering. And I believe it was Tommy who mentioned that sheltering homeless services is typically a county engagement. And so I'm curious, and I'm not sure if this is a parking lot question or if we can get some commentary today from the city, but how did the city get into that business?
I would suggest that's a parking lot question, and we can provide some context and background for that. Yeah, that's a great question. All right, I'm going to move us to you doing a little talking amongst yourselves. We basically have some pretty good natural groups at the tables. Maybe this table wants to split up into two groups. We'd like you to just talk amongst yourselves for about 5 minutes, what questions you have about our potential revenue targets, and we'll come back and report out to the group so that we can answer that. So we'll give you about 5 minutes and check in. Okay? Go. All right, it's been 5 minutes. We'll give you 5 more. All right, everyone, I'm going to call us back just for a short moment. You probably do have questions. We've been at this for an hour and 10 minutes. We're going to take a 10-minute break, and then we'll come back and debrief on your questions. Okay? All right, everyone, we've been gavelled back to order. I hope you enjoyed your break, and if you wanted a snack, you got a snack. Let's talk about the questions that your groups had. And I'm going to start with our group in the back, Matt, Bev, and Bill, so you feel included. Questions?
Okay, Matt Hale, we had a nice little robust discussion up here, and I went and talked to Tommy on the break, and we were just trying to understand in the pre-read packet. There were several service level gap numbers there, actually two. One of them was 121 FTE, and the other one was 307.5 FTE. We were just trying to understand where those fit into pathway. Not pathway 2, but your second target, the service level target. And I think Tommy and I we talked through that, and Tommy had a great answer to that. You want to take the answer, Tommy?
Sure, thanks, Matthew. Tommy Conkling, Moss Adams. In page 4 of your pre-read packet, what Matthew's referring to is there's a pretty simple bar graph. On the far left, it's current FTE. In the middle, total FTE, in full-time equivalent employees, to meet the pre-recession service level gap. And like I was saying before, it's imperfect, but that's that gap. And then that third one is current FTE, and then together with the deferred needs FTE that were identified back in 2022. And so the question was, where does that service level target fit in here? So that target would be somewhere between that first and second bar graph. It's between, and again, it would vary by year because it would slowly grow, keeping service levels consistent with population. But it is less than the amount that you would need to reach that pre-recession service level gap, as we call it. Thank you.
Any other questions from your team? Okay, great. Levy, David, Katie, would you like to go next?
Oh, okay. Well, I mean, I think your main question was why we would decide on a service level and just leave that to the city council, and rather just look at each tax and how much it can raise, then max out kind of the amount of taxes we can raise, and let the city council then pick which taxes would be the right ones and what their service level they think they should provide.
Yeah, that's a great question, and you're correct. You don't have to say, this is the target we're shooting for, but we also want an understanding of the range and magnitude as we go into the options, so that whatever you ultimately present to council, you feel comfortable with, and also that they can tie to a service level. Great question. Okay, I'm going to go over here. Do you have a spokesperson?
Stephen Jenkins. I think the two questions we had, one I think we've asked already, which is can we know what it would cost at service level to meet the city's master plan, essentially, including all the deferred needs, et cetera. I think the second question was, numbers are big, it's hard to, I think, for your average person to quantify in their mind what $51.5 million looks like. So understanding what does it look like for a household or a person in the city of Salem when you spread that cost out over our residents?
That's a great question. Josh, is that one you want to answer today? No. There is information in the budget on per household tax revenues, right? Sorry, Josh.
That's certainly something we can bring back. Just basically the target per capita or per household, we can bring those numbers back. It's publicly available numbers, so we'll get it back.
All right, great. Those are your two questions. How about this group right here?
Ray Quisenberry. I'm not sure if we actually discussed a question, did we? I think we talked about what we would like to do other than do the assignment. So.
Got it. Thank you, Ray. All right, Ken, Beth, Nate, I think you were a group.
Raquel Moore Green. And I had a question. I know Ken had a question. Mine was on the sheltering target there. So you've got a number that grows. Is it really reasonable to think that we're going to continue to need the sheltering? And I guess that led to the first question is, what is contained in that sheltering number? Is it wraparound services? Is it actual roofs over the head? Is it rent assistance? What is that number? Or what makes that up?
That's an awesome question, and here's Josh.
Really good question. So it includes the current services that are being provided. So the 3 micro shelters, the navigation center, Safe Park, our kind of enhanced towing, motorhome destruction kind of funding. So all those current programs. And then just the cost is just escalated over time. So the 9.6 is the current cost of those programs.
Okay. Follow up. So are you anticipating that the number of people needing shelter is going to continue to grow?
So this assumes the current services stay the same, so it doesn't anticipate additional services being added. So I don't have the answer for you that you're asking, but it assumes just the current services being provided, not that there's going to be additional unsheltered people in Salem.
And Ken, did you have a question as well?
Kind of along the same line, which is when we decided to use one-time funds for homelessness, was there a plan for continued funding of these services, or I guess a little of the thinking behind where we started to where we find ourselves now?
Yeah, appreciate the question. So yes, it was started with ARPA funding, continued with state grant funding. Many cities started these kind of one-time programs with one-time money, and it was certainly a consideration. But if you remember back to that time, we had a pretty significant problem downtown. We had a pretty significant problem in our parks. It was very needed. So the city council took the action to start those programs.
All right, I'm going to move us over to our last group. Do you have a spokesperson?
Becky Beeman. We spent most of our time complaining about the decisions that City Council has made, which is not part of our charter. We questioned things that they have chosen to pay for, and we questioned decisions made to reduce FTE out of necessity. And we've been handed a baseline to use libraries, because we have a thing of information here. There's been a decision made to cut us back to a level of services that puts us 25 out of 25 libraries in the state in some areas. And we, in our charter, don't have a real mechanism to address that unless we create a new option for finding revenue that makes doing something with the libraries a revenue positive thing. And we recognize that that's out of scope. But we're frustrated with the rules we've been handed.
There are options at your disposal when you get the revenue options, the preliminary packet, in just a few minutes. There are options to look at for things like how much bigger do we want to go? Dedicated sources of funding, things like that. Those are absolutely not off the table. It's true that council has made some policy decisions and some really tough decisions in the last couple of months, specifically around things like the library, some vacant positions, things like that. So your recommendation to council can absolutely be X funding, and our recommendation is to restore library services, for example. I don't believe that that is out of scope. because your scope is not limited to this, but unfortunately that is included in this current analysis because that's our baseline today. Yeah, Scott.
Scott Cantonwine. We had one small group down here that I don't think we reported out
I'm so
on yet.
sorry I skipped you.
That's okay. Your comments are kind of a good segue. Our point was looking at those 41 options and wanting to really understand what's the potential revenue generated by each target, and then also looking at the associated administrative, enforcement, collection costs to really understand kind of a cost benefit, to understand the big fish, if you will.
That's a good segue and a good, it's a great segue into our next section. So do you actually want to do this poll or, okay, I think I know the answer to this already. We're just going to do an informal by hands poll, whether you want to move forward with these current targets that we have provided, those 3 pathways, or if you want to explore alternative targets. So if we could do a show of hands for option A, the current identified targets. I see a couple, yeah. Okay, and option B? All right, that's where I thought we were gonna go. Okay, great. We'll continue to provide additional information, and it will also come out as we're looking at revenue options as well. Okay, Annie Rose, back to you.
All right, so the moment you've all been waiting for, which is new information. So we included in the pre-read packet a list of over 40 revenue options just by title. And so tonight what we want to do is start the process of providing you more information in terms of the analysis and details on each one of these revenue options. So as part of this, I do want to stress that we will, in a few moments, be providing this revenue packet. I'm not going to give it to you yet because otherwise you will all read it and not hear a single word that I say for the next 5 minutes. But within this revenue packet, what I'm going to do is go through all of the contents so that you have an understanding of what you're getting, and then we're going to give you some time to actually sit with this material, and you will have plenty of time after this meeting as well. But one thing I wanted to highlight here is you see on this very, very tiny illegible slide up here, there are 41 revenue options that have been identified so far. This is not a complete list. We can add to this list as we go. We are going to certainly be removing some of these items as we go as well, but this is our starting point. We wanted to present a broad list of potential options for you here. In terms of the source of where all of these come from, some of these are items that the city has previously considered. Some of them are items that members of this group have already brought forward and said, I'm really interested in examining this. Some of these are items that other cities within Oregon have looked at as well. So we, again, want to make sure that you are starting this process from sort of the most broad lens possible so that as you're narrowing it down, we're not leaving any options on the table. So within that, like I said, we are going to be handing you a packet in just a few moments. The reason that we are giving you this information is first and foremost just to make sure that we're all on the same page around the breadth of potential options that are available. Again, we may be adding to this as we go. We also have started to provide for you some information that can be used to analyze these options, thinking about what are the constraints, what are the impacts of some of these potential options. We want to be able to give you enough information so that we can come back at our next meeting and really dig in and have a very robust discussion around potential revenue options that we will obviously continue throughout the rest of our work together as well. So again, this is meant to be kind of the baseline information that we can use as our jumping off point for the rest of this work moving forward. The other piece that we will be using throughout this conversation is thinking about these potential revenue options through 2 different lenses. We're going to bring a lot of different lenses into this work, a lot of different criteria, but these are 2 at the very highest level that we're going to have to think about. And the first is just policy considerations. How might these revenue options play out within our community? How might they help us meet the needs of Salem residents? Thinking through from that sort of strategic perspective. But another really major piece that this group is going to have to grasp and grapple with is the technical constraints, because a lot of these options have very specific financial, administrative political, logistical characteristics that will impact how, when, or if they can be levied, essentially. And anything that is technically deemed not feasible, even if it has fantastic policy considerations, that's going to have to come into play, right? We can't have one without the other. So just introducing those two concepts, because we're going to be coming back to that again quite a bit throughout this process. So within the packet, for each of these revenue options, we have presented, first of all, a matrix. And on this matrix, again, you will be able to read it in more detail when we give you this packet. But the purpose of this matrix is to give you an easy way to start to think about and compare each one of these revenue options. Within this, we have quite a few different columns here. The first one is the estimated overall viability. And we want to emphasize that most of these columns are estimates, approximations, or our team's consideration in terms of our opinion of these different options here. So none of this information is set in stone apart from maybe some of the legal considerations that we're bringing up. So that first column, it says estimated overall viability. And that's basically how viable do we think this option might be when we take into totality all of the different elements, how much revenue it might raise, how politically complex it might be, how administratively difficult it might be. And right now, those are broken out just into more viable, less viable, or would currently require a change in state law in order to implement. So pretty basic there. But again, just trying to give you a sense if you wanted to focus your energy on potentially some of the more viable options. The next one is estimated revenue potential. And what you'll see here is that for some of these items, we have some specific numbers to go with them because the city has already done some estimation, some financial modeling around these. But for a lot of these options, we will have language like the revenue is likely high, likely low. These are very, very broad categories. As we move through this process and we start narrowing down options, we'll also be able to bring back a lot more information on the potential financial impacts of each one of these items as well. So again, in the interest of time, we wanted to get this out to you. We will anticipate a lot more information coming through in that category. The third column over is our current understanding of the legal authority. Can the city actually do this? Again, I will say and I will stress that no legal team has reviewed this document, so some things might change here, but this is based on our current understanding of whether it is within the city's jurisdiction to levy or put forward some of these revenue options. The fourth column is estimated administrative complexity. How difficult would it be in terms of internal to the city? Would we need to hire additional staff? Would we need to set up whole new programs, systems to support these things? Or can they be done fairly simply within our current structures? Again, this is an estimate based on our current understanding. The next one there is estimated time to implement. Some of these items could be implemented much faster than others. Some will take longer, and therefore it will be more years out before revenue is generated. So we have some estimates in there as well. And then the last one is political complexity. And again, this one is an estimate, and a lot of what this team is going to be doing is thinking through really what are some of the political complexities here, what might be more or less realistic or viable for our community. But we have noted some details that might be helpful as you're thinking through that. So again, this first matrix is just an overview. To support this matrix and provide a lot more detail, oh boy, you really can't read that one. For each revenue option, we have given you at least a page of information that goes into more depth on each one of those categories that I was just talking about. In addition to that, we have some other categories on this list, things like equity considerations. Who is this tax actually impacting, or this revenue option impacting? Who's going to pay for it? And how might that play out in terms of, is this regressive structure, for example, where regardless of your income level, you're going to be paying the same amount, which under those structures, typically it means that if you're lower income, you're paying a higher percentage of your income toward that revenue option? Or is it more of a progressive structure? There's Obviously, depending on the revenue option, that's going to look different. But we have some details in there as well. So we have some additional categories that you will see there too. Again, providing the information that we know to this point in time. We will be adding to this as we go as well. But again, we wanted to give you a good set of shared information so that you can all come into the next conversation together. So with that, I am officially going to pass out these documents, and then we're going to give you 5 minutes just to sit with the document and see if there's any questions about just the contents, not about the revenue options themselves, but just about what is in this document and how is it structured. So we'll pass these out, give you a couple minutes to sit with that. All right, I hate to break into this concentrated silence here, but I am sure you are already digging into a lot of the content of this packet. Are there any initial questions about just the layout, how information is presented, or any of the categories? One question I already received is, will we get a digital copy? And the answer is absolutely yes. We will be sending that out right after this meeting, and it will be posted to the city's website as well for any members of the public who would like to see this. So any other questions about the content? And I'm gonna go here and then there.
Keith Norris, is the column on estimated overall viability, is that fair to say that's kind of your summation of the other 5 columns that are in there?
Yep, absolutely. Okay. Thank you.
Nate Raffin. Just this portion, would it be possible to get access or to get an email of this in an Excel spreadsheet form?
Yes, we could definitely do that.
Okay, I would appreciate that.
Yeah, absolutely. Okay. Great. Any other questions? TJ?
I didn't see in the list of options annexing all the already developed land inside the urban growth boundary, but outside the city limits.
So you are anticipating our next question for you all, which will be writing down any initial questions that you have about these options, but also adding any additional options. So that's something that we'll start the process of collecting tonight, and then we'll obviously be able to do that also moving forward. So thank you for that one. Any other questions about the packet content or just the layout? What's in here? Okay. Oh, go for it.
Nate Raffin again. Just a suggestion. It might be helpful for this particular section to have like a data visualization, perhaps color-coded.
Yeah.
You know, less viable could be red, more viable could be green, and it might help us just visually be able to grasp which options are more desirable and which parts of which options are more desirable, if that makes sense.
Yes, absolutely. Yeah. Thank you for that feedback on the matrix. We can definitely take a swing through and see if we can make that a little bit more visual. Thanks. TJ.
Sorry, TJ Sullivan, Ward 4. And one more follow-up on the levy piece. I know compression is an issue. How much room do we have? Having that information in our pack would be, I think, important to know.
Great. And I don't know if that's something you want to address right now or something we can do in follow-up.
I guess just real briefly, I think we covered a little bit of it at the last meeting. But on the Marion County side of Salem, we're already at the maximum rate, over the maximum rate, so there are some properties in compression. On the Polk County side, we're not at the $10 limit, so there's some room there. That doesn't mean that all properties are in compression, so it's a little nuanced, and we can definitely bring something back for you for that.
Thank you. Yeah.
Scott Canton one. Can you clarify the estimated time to implement what all is included in that time cycle?
Yeah, and actually, Tommy, do you want to talk a little bit more about what goes in there?
That's a great question. It is highly variable depending on which revenue option you're talking about. Generally speaking, it's a best guess of how long would it likely take until we could get actual dollars for the city to use. Simply enacting a tax doesn't mean that dollars arrive to the city. For more complicated taxes, particularly where partnering with the state or another public entity collecting a similar tax would be impossible, the city itself would have to establish its own staffing processes, information systems, et cetera, to collect that. So pointedly to your question, it varies a lot. In some instances, it's going to be, hey, we had an agreement with the Oregon Department of Revenue to collect X tax, and it's super easy and we get it. With others, it is, oh, we have to hire some amount of staff and have some sort of monitoring and compliance infrastructure to get those dollars in.
And I think that that brings up a really excellent point for all of these options and a lot of the information that's in this packet is you'll see right now it's very high level. There's a lot of generalities. There's a lot of broad information that is included here or estimates that are included here. As we go through the process of narrowing down to some more options that this group might bring forward, we're going to be adding information to this as we go for sure. We can't obviously do deep financial analysis on every single one of these options at this point in time for today's meeting, but we certainly know that in order to make decisions as a group, you're going to need more information than what is currently in this packet. So this is for sure just our jumping off point for the rest of the information here too.
Matt Hale. So as we're looking at this helps inform our initial decision-making as we present and we work with our colleagues here on the committee. I'm curious, is there a way, I understand this is a living document, is there a way that you can asterisk where in other Oregon cities or municipalities, some of these 41 ideas are already currently working and kind of what percentage of their general fund revenue they're contributing to?
Yeah, absolutely. So within the packet itself right now, we do have one column on the details page that talks about peer usage. It, again, is very high level, but it should give you a general sense of what are the cities that we already know might be using some of these revenue options. And again, as we dig in there, we can bring you back more information on that front, because I think that's going to be a very critical part when we're thinking about viability or political community viability for some of these options. Great point. Okay, so it is 8:21.
Excuse me, I have a question.
Oh yeah, thank you.
Would it be possible, I'm not sure if we would have to move to legal size paper to add another column to this spreadsheet. Would it be possible to get, and again, I know this would be an estimation, but some characterization of the cost benefit analysis for each option? Essentially weighing the revenue potential less the administrative complexity.
Yes. I think that when we get into some of the more detailed revenue, the actual revenue generation that will come from that I think instead of just kind of breaking it down to that very simple cost benefit analysis, I think what will be most helpful for this group is to have how much revenue can this actually generate, and then really understanding all of the rest of the pieces, part of which will be that administrative cost. So that'll be part of it for sure. I don't know if we'll do that direct comparison necessarily, because there's obviously a lot of other factors in there, but as we go through, I think that will be certainly part of the conversation. Thank you.
Thank you.
All right, well, we would like to get you out of here definitely before 9. So what I would like to do next is take the next 5 minutes, and again, this is the start of this process, but I'd like to take 5 minutes and have you have some sticky notes at each of your place settings. If you have any initial questions about the revenue options right now that you already know, or if you have any suggestions for additional revenue options that you would like to see. I want to stress this will not be your only opportunity to provide this feedback. We just want to gather kind of what's top of mind for you tonight. We're also going to be collecting these sticky notes and including all of the comments in the meeting agenda notes that will be publicized as well. So these will be made public, even though we're not going to be able to get through each one of them or answer those questions tonight. We want to get a general sense of any initial pieces that you have. So we're just going to take 5 minutes. If you do have any, again, initial questions or ideas for additional revenue options, please write them down on those sticky notes and we will collect them. All right, it's 8:30, so I'm going to bring us back together, and what I'm going to ask is any of the questions that you wrote down, any of the additional revenue options at the end of the meeting, if you could bring them up to this lectern, we will collect them here, and again, we will include those in the meeting minutes for everyone to see. We know that this is nowhere near enough time to actually fully dig into these revenue options, and so between now and the next meeting, we ask that you go through this packet in more detail, see what other questions you might have. You are welcome to send those questions to us in the meantime. If you do have additional revenue options that you didn't mention tonight but think of over the course of the next week, please also send those to me. Again, you have my email address, so you'll be able to do that so we can start collecting and making sure that we have as broad of a list as possible for next meeting's conversation as well. A couple more points of logistics before we let you go for the evening. A couple pieces here. As I mentioned, we ask for you to review these options in advance of the meeting in March. The March meeting is really where we are going to start digging in and really thinking about how do we want to think about the decision-making process around narrowing down and discussing options here, as well as really getting into a lot of the questions around the options that might come up as well. So that's going to be our meeting. That's going to be the primary focus of that meeting. Another thing that I wanted to note is that we got some feedback in moving the meeting to this room. The June 6th meeting date is no longer feasible for that. So we're also going to be sending you all a survey to see if there's an alternative date that will work for a majority of this group. So expect to see that survey. We also know that that is graduation time for many, so we are trying to be sensitive as we reschedule that meeting as well. So you expect to see that coming in the next week or so from our team. And then the last piece is, as you all know, the next task force meeting is going to be on March 18th, and we are very much looking forward to seeing you all there. So with that, I believe those are the last items of our evening. Would you do us the honors of adjourning unless we have? Great, we have a question. Thank you.
Thank you, Raquel Moore Green. If memory serves me right, and if I monitor my emails correctly, we had a list from last session of things that you were going to come back to us with answers. Did I miss that email?
You did not miss that email, and thank you so much for bringing that up. So we're going to do a combo of answering some of the questions that came up in the first meeting as well as this meeting. So that will be part of follow-up materials that we will be sending out. Thank you so much for highlighting that.
Russ Beaton. I've had a lot of citizens ask us how they would get involved in the focus groups. So I'd kind of like to know what's the plan for the focus groups? How will they be administered? How could people get into them, et cetera? I take seriously in our charter that we're to get out into the community and get as much other information as we can.
Thank you so much for bringing that up and for bringing forward the point that this group, we are going to be calling on you for some of these outreach processes. We're going to have two different pieces three different pieces. We have the focus groups, we have a community survey, and we also have town halls. So for the focus groups, an open application was posted, so we solicited input, and I think we had about 122 people apply for those focus groups. Those will be happening next week. There's no expectation for this group to be part of those meetings, but they are done by ward so that we have representation. We will then be using some of the input from those focus groups as well as from this group to inform the community survey that's going to be administered by DHM. So that's going to be a representative community survey that's going out. The big piece where any member of the community can participate will be the town halls that are happening in April. And that's going to be a moment when we will call on you to be part of those town halls, to get the word out about those. Currently, those are scheduled for April 10th and April 23rd. And I am blanking on the location for the April 10th meeting, but I know the April 23rd one will be at Center 50 Plus, so we can share out more information on the location on those two as well. But that will be upcoming in April when we will be asking for additional input there. Thank you. Any other questions? Yeah.
Beth Vargas Duncan, Ward 3. Could we be copied on the focus group meetings? So if we want to just be a member of the public listening, that we could do so?
Great question. Those are not public meetings. Those are going to
Okay.
be closed sessions.
But the town halls are?
Yes,
Okay,
but the town halls, that will be the opportunity to hear from as many people as we
Okay,
can.
great, thanks.
Thank you. Any other questions? All right, I jumped the gun before, but I think we are now ready to formally adjourn the meeting.
So we are adjourned.
I move to adjourn.
Move to adjourn. All in favor, say aye.
Aye.
We are adjourned.
Thank you.